Welcome. This viewer story, Patricia Delaney, begins with the ultimate betrayal. Her own daughter stole everything and abandoned her in the remote Scottish Highlands. But what her daughter thought was the end of Pat's life was actually the beginning of an unbelievable journey to an unexpected family inheritance. Do you have a story of betrayal or triumph? Submit it now to womenstoriess@segmail.com. Get out and let's see how tough you feel when you have no way to get home. Charlotte's voice cut through the Scottish Highland air like a razor wire. Mark gunned the rental car engine, gravel spraying from the tires as they disappeared down the winding country road, leaving me, Patricia Delaney, standing alone with my suitcase on a patch of grass that barely qualified as a village square. That's when I realized my own daughter had just declared war on me. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Now, let me back up and tell you exactly how a 62-year-old American woman ended up stranded in the middle of nowhere, Scotland. Because, trust me, it wasn't on any travel brochure I'd ever seen. 3 weeks earlier, Charlotte had called me with what she claimed was exciting news. "Mom, Mark's company is sending him to Glasgow for a presentation, and we thought it would be wonderful if you joined us for a little family vacation afterward." I should have known something was off when she used the word wonderful. Charlotte hadn't found anything about me wonderful since her late teens, but like the fool I apparently was, I'd gotten excited. When was the last time my daughter had invited me anywhere? When was the last time she'd wanted to spend time with me that didn't involve watching her children or covering her unexpected bills? So, I'd booked my flight, packed my best, most comfortable clothes, and even purchased a new, not convenient to name brand, lens for my existing camera to document our wonderful family trip. The trouble started the moment I met them at Edinburgh Airport. Charlotte took one look at my outfit, a perfectly respectable tailored linen suit I'd bought specifically for the trip, and rolled her eyes so hard, I'm surprised they didn't require immediate medical attention. "Really, Mom? You're going to dress like a history professor the entire time we're here?" Mark, ever the charmer, had smirked from behind his phone. "At least she matches the scenery, all those old ruins and historical plaques." I'd bitten my tongue, determined not to let their ingrained rudeness ruin what I'd hoped would be a chance to reconnect. For 3 days, I'd followed them around Edinburgh like a third wheel they couldn't shake. When they wanted to eat at incredibly expensive seafood restaurants near the not convenient to name place pier, I'd paid without complaint. When they wanted to shop for items they couldn't possibly afford, I'd handed over my not convenient to name brand credit card with a smile. When they'd booked us into separate hotel rooms, because everyone needs their space, I'd agreed cheerfully, noting the cost difference was substantial. Yesterday morning, Mark had announced we were taking a scenic drive through the Highlands. "You'll love it, Patricia," he'd said, using my full name the way he always did when he was being condescending. Very authentic Scottish experience. The drive had been beautiful. I'll give him that. Rolling hills covered in purple heather, ancient stone bridges crossing streams that sparkled in the late September sunlight. For a moment, sitting in the back seat of their rental car, I'd actually felt grateful to be there with them. That was before Charlotte turned around with that familiar expression of barely controlled irritation. "Mom, can you please stop taking pictures of every crumbling sheep pen and rock we pass? You're making the whole car shake." "I'm documenting our trip," I'd said mildly. "For what? Your antique textile blog that nobody reads?" Mark had laughed at his own joke. "For my memory. I want to remember this time with you." That's when Charlotte's expression had changed, hardening into something I didn't recognize. Our time together, right? She'd exchanged a look with Mark that made my stomach clench. Actually, Mom, there's something we need to talk to you about. And that's how I'd learned, somewhere between a centuries-old stone church and this god-forsaken village called Kilbride that probably had more sheep than people, that I was apparently a burden they could no longer carry. "We've been patient with you for years," Charlotte had said, her voice rising with each word. "But you're suffocating us. You're always there, always wanting to be included, always acting like we owe you something, just because you're our mother." Now here I stood, watching their tail lights disappear around a bend in the road, with exactly $43 in my wallet, a dead cell phone, and the sinking realization that my own daughter had just abandoned me in a foreign country like an unwanted pet. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same daughter I'd raised alone after her father walked out when she was 12. The silence after their car disappeared was absolute. No traffic, no voices, just wind whistling through what looked like the remains of an old stone church and the distant bleating of sheep. I stood there for a full minute, suitcase handle gripping tight in my hand, trying to process what had just happened. My first coherent thought was remarkably practical. I needed to find a phone. The second thought was less helpful. What kind of mother raises a daughter capable of this level of cruelty? But standing here feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to get me back to civilization. So I picked up my suitcase and started walking toward what appeared to be the village center. And I use the term center loosely. We're talking about maybe 6 stone buildings clustered around what might charitably be called a main street. The first building looked like it hadn't been occupied since the Highland clans roamed these hills. The second appeared to be someone's house, but the windows were dark and there were no signs of life. The third building had a faded sign hanging askew that read, "Kilbride Post Office." But when I tried the door, it was locked tight. "Wonderful," I muttered, and immediately heard Charlotte's voice in my head, mocking my word choice. Even abandoned in the Scottish Highlands, I couldn't escape my daughter's criticism. That's when I heard it. The faint sound of music coming from somewhere up the street. Real music, with actual instruments, not some ghostly Highland bagpipe echoing across the moors. I followed the sound like a beacon, dragging my suitcase behind me over cobblestones that had probably been there since before America was even discovered. The music led me to a building that looked marginally more alive than the others. A wooden sign creaked in the wind. The Shepherd's Rest Inn and Public House. Through windows that could have used a good cleaning, I could see warm light and the silhouettes of people inside. I stood outside that door for longer than I care to admit, trying to gather the courage to go inside. What was I going to say? "Excuse me, but my daughter just dumped me here like a bag of garbage, and I need to use your phone." It sounded pathetic, even in my head. But standing in the Scottish wind wasn't going to improve my situation. So, I pushed open that heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The conversation stopped the moment I appeared. Not gradually, not politely. It just died like someone had hit a mute button on the entire room. 6 or 7 people, all locals by the look of them, turned to stare at the American woman with the suitcase who just interrupted their evening. "Evening," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wonder if I might use your phone. I seem to find myself in a bit of a situation." A woman behind the bar, probably in her 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes, stepped forward. "American, are ye?" Her accent was thick but warm. "What brings you to Kilbride with a suitcase at this hour?" And that's when the absurdity of my situation hit me full force. I started laughing. Not happy laughter, the slightly hysterical kind that bubbles up when your life becomes so ridiculous you can't process it normally. My daughter, I managed between gasps, just left me here because apparently I'm a burden she can no longer carry. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Then the woman behind the bar, whose name was Isabel Izzy Grant, I learned later, said something that surprised me. Well then, she's a right fool, isn't she? Come on, sit yourself down and tell us what happened. For the next hour, over a cup of tea that was strong enough to revive the Highland ghosts, I told my story to Isabel and the small group of Scottish strangers who listened without a hint of judgment. I recounted the years of quiet accommodation, the constant financial demands, the snide remarks from Charlotte and Mark, and finally, the cruelty of the abandonment in a place whose name I could barely pronounce. The locals, gathered around the old fireplace, asked practical, thoughtful questions. Did I have enough money for a train ticket to a major city? Could I access my funds remotely? Did I want them to contact the police in Edinburgh immediately? That last question gave me pause. Did I want to call the police on my own daughter? The thought was tempting, sharp, and dark, a primal urge for retaliation. But what would that accomplish besides adding public humiliation and media scrutiny to the pain of abandonment? No police, I said finally, my voice steadier than before. But I would appreciate directions to the nearest town with a hotel and an accessible ATM. That's when Isabel, or Izzy, as she asked me to call her, delivered the news that made my situation go from merely bad to critically desperate. The nearest proper hotel is in Stirling, about 40 miles south, but there's no reliable public transport here, and a taxi would cost you more than you likely have. She was right. $43 wouldn't cover a taxi to the next village, let alone a hotel room and meals, while I figured out how to get home to the States. However, Izzy continued, and I heard a flicker of hope creep into her warm, thick accent. We do have a small room upstairs that we rent out sometimes. It's nothing fancy, a bit rustic, mind you, but it's clean and warm. $20 for the night, breakfast included. I wanted to embrace this woman. $20 I could afford, and it would give me time to think, to plan, to figure out how to get out of this mess with whatever dignity I had left. As I climbed those narrow stairs behind Izzy, my suitcase bumping against the worn wooden banister, I caught a glimpse of myself in an old mirror hanging in the hallway. My hair was disheveled from the wind, my carefully planned travel suit wrinkled, and my eyes looked utterly shell-shocked. But underneath the shock, something else was stirring, something that felt surprisingly like steely determination. Charlotte thought she could dump me here and break me. She was about to learn that her mother, the retired specialist in 19th century European textiles and artifacts, was tougher than she remembered. The room above the Shepherd's Rest was exactly as Izzy had described, clean and warm. It had a single bed with a thick wool blanket, a wash basin with running water, and a small window that looked out over the quiet village square, where I'd been abandoned just hours earlier. I sat on that bed and made a mental list. Find a way to charge my phone, contact my bank to access more money, book transportation back to Edinburgh, and somehow get home to the American Midwest. The phone charging turned out to be easy enough. Izzy had a universal adapter behind the bar. While it powered up, she served me a dinner that I hadn't ordered but desperately needed: thick Scottish soup, fresh bread, and a glass of deep red wine that instantly began to loosen the knot in my chest. So, Izzy said, settling into the chair across from me. What's your plan then? Survive until I can get home, I said honestly, and try to figure out how my relationship with my daughter became so broken that she could do something like this. Izzy nodded thoughtfully. Families are complicated things. I've got a son in Glasgow who thinks I'm too old to run this place by myself. He keeps sending me brochures for not convenient to name brand assisted living facilities. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. As if 20 years of running an inn has suddenly made me incompetent overnight. Children, I said, raising my wine glass, apparently think they know what's best for us. Apparently, she agreed, clinking her glass against mine. That's when my phone finally came back to life, buzzing frantically with a dozen missed calls and twice as many text messages. My heart jumped. Maybe Charlotte had realized what she'd done. Maybe she was coming back. Maybe this nightmare was over. But when I scrolled through the messages, my hope curdled into something much darker. They weren't apologies from Charlotte or Mark at all. They were urgent, automated alerts from my bank. Unusual account activity. Please confirm these transactions. Your debit card has been declined. My hands started shaking as I called the customer service number. After 10 minutes on hold and another 10 minutes of verification questions, I learned the cold, devastating truth. Charlotte had been making massive charges on my account all week. Expensive hotel rooms, high-end meals, endless shopping trips, even a spa day yesterday while I thought she was visiting a museum. But the real shock came when I asked about my savings account balance. The account that should have held nearly $60,000 USD had less than $800 USD. Ma'am, you authorized these transfers to your daughter's account 3 months ago, the customer service representative explained patiently. We have the signed authorization documents in our files. Signed documents I'd never seen, let alone signed. Charlotte had somehow gained illegal access to my accounts and had been systematically draining them. The abandonment in Scotland wasn't just emotional cruelty. It was the final calculated step in what had apparently been a month-long plan to steal everything I had. I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence. Izzy, who'd been politely pretending not to listen, took one look at my face and poured me another glass of wine without saying a word. It's worse than I thought, I finally managed to say. And then, because keeping it inside felt like it might kill me, I told her everything. The unauthorized transfers, the forged digital documents, the systematic financial abuse that had been going on for months without my knowledge. That's not just abandonment, Izzy said quietly when I finished. That's elder abuse, financial abuse. It's a crime. It's my daughter, I said, the words heavy and meaningless. Makes it worse, not better, she replied firmly. Family members who do this know exactly how much damage they're causing. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the murmur of conversation from the locals downstairs. Finally, Izzy spoke again. How long can you stay here with what money ye have left? I did the math in my head. Maybe a week if I'm extremely careful. Then we have a week to figure out how to get you back on your feet, she said, matter-of-factly. We? You think I'm going to let some American grandmother get swindled by her own child and not help? I may run a pub in the middle of nowhere, but I still have principles. The kindness from this stranger who owed me nothing was almost harder to bear than my daughter's betrayal. I hadn't cried since Charlotte's car disappeared, but suddenly the tears came hard and fast. Izzy handed me a box of tissues and waited patiently while I fell apart. When I finally composed myself, she was still sitting there, with a determined expression I was beginning to recognize. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start fighting back." I looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. "I don't even know where to begin." "Lucky for ye," Izzy smiled grimly. "I do. My late husband used to say that when someone shows ye who they really are, you better believe them. Your daughter has shown you exactly who she is. Now it's time to show her who you are." That night, lying in the narrow bed, listening to the Highland wind rattle the windows, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going home broken and defeated. I was going home stronger than I'd ever been. Charlotte thought she'd destroyed me. She had no idea what she'd actually done. She'd set me free. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, which seemed appropriate for my mood, until Isabel appeared at my door with a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the Highland ghosts, and a smile that suggested she'd been doing some serious strategic thinking overnight. "Get dressed," she announced. "We have work to do." "What kind of work?" I asked. But she was already heading back downstairs, leaving me to wonder what this formidable Scottish woman had planned. 20 minutes later, I found myself following Izzy down a muddy path behind the inn, through a gate I hadn't noticed yesterday, and toward what looked like an abandoned stone building about the size of a small warehouse. The structure was ancient, probably centuries old, with thick walls and narrow windows, but the roof looked solid, and the door was secured with a relatively modern, heavy-duty lock. "What is this place?" I asked, as Izzy produced a large, tarnished iron key from her coat pocket. "Used to be a wool warehouse," she said, working the lock with effort. "Back when this area was part of the main sheep farming route between the Highlands and Glasgow. My husband's grandfather bought it in the 1950s, thinking he'd convert it into something profitable. He was always a dreamer. Never got around to it, bless his heart." The door swung open with a rusty creak, and Izzy stepped inside, gesturing for me to follow. What I saw took my breath away. The building was vast, filled with furniture, artwork, china, books, and what appeared to be several decades' worth of collected antiques, all covered haphazardly with dust sheets and organized in rough, dusty categories throughout the space. Celtic pottery sat next to writing desks from the Victorian era. Oil paintings in ornate, heavy frames leaned against walls next to collections of vintage books with leather bindings. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. "Good Lord," I breathed, pulling a dust sheet off what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden chest with beautiful brass fittings. "How long has all this been here?" "Decades," Izzy said, walking deeper into the warehouse. "People would bring things here when they moved, died, or downsized. My husband never had the heart to turn anyone away, and he was always convinced he'd get around to sorting through it all someday. After he died 5 years ago, I just locked the door and tried to forget about the sheer amount of work required." I ran my fingers along the surface of the wooden chest. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and despite the thick layer of dust, I could see the rich grain of what looked like mahogany underneath. "Izzy, some of this could be quite valuable." "That's what I'm hoping," she said, turning to face me with a serious, businesslike expression. "Because I have a proposition for ye." I looked up from the chest, waiting. "I desperately need help cataloging and researching all this," she continued, gesturing around the vast, cluttered space. "There's probably enough here to fill an entire antique shop, but I don't know what's worth selling and what's worth keeping. I don't know the difference between clutter and coin. And I, on the other hand," I finished for her, "spent 30 years as a specialist in 19th century European textiles and artifacts back in the States. Didn't you mention that last night?" I had mentioned it during one of my rambling, hysterical explanations of how I'd ended up stranded in Scotland. Before my marriage to Charlotte's father, before Charlotte, I'd worked at the not convenient to name museum, specializing in historical artifacts and their preservation. It felt like a lifetime ago. That was a long time ago, I said carefully, uncertainty clouding my voice. Skills like that don't expire, Pat, Izzy said firmly. And here's my official offer. You help me sort through all this, meticulously research what we've got, and maybe even help me set up some sort of proper selling operation, online or through auctioneers, and I'll split the profits with you 50-50. I stared at her. You barely know me. I know enough, she replied simply. I know you were abandoned by someone who should have protected you. I know you're smart enough to have managed a serious collection. I know you need money to get back on your feet. And I know I'm sitting on what could be a small fortune if we do this right. I walked deeper into the warehouse, pulling back more dust sheets. A complete, unchipped set of fine, not convenient to name designer china. A collection of first edition, not convenient to name country, history books that made my professional artifact heart skip a beat. A painting that looked suspiciously like it might be a minor master from the 18th century. This could take months, I said. Good, Izzy replied with a grin. Because I've got plenty of time, and now it seems you do too. She was perfectly right. Charlotte's ultimate betrayal had inadvertently given me something I hadn't had in years. Complete freedom from suffocating family obligations. No grandchildren to babysit. No daughter to enable. No one expecting me to be the accommodating mother who never made waves. What about selling what we find? I asked, refocusing on the practical aspects. I don't know anything about the antique market here in Scotland. Izzy smiled, her eyes twinkling. That's where it gets interesting. My neighbor's nephew runs an auction house in Edinburgh. High-end stuff, mostly. He's been after me for years to let him evaluate some of the pieces that have been sitting here. Never seemed worth the trouble before, but with two of us working on it. I picked up what appeared to be a small porcelain figurine, turning it over to look at the maker's mark on the bottom. My museum training kicked in automatically, and I felt a familiar thrill of professional recognition. Izzy, I said slowly, dusting the base carefully. This is a figure from not convenient to name brand's early production period. If it's authentic and in good condition, it could be worth several £100, easily. Her eyes widened. For that little thing? For that little thing. I set it down carefully and looked around the vast, silent warehouse with completely new eyes. If this one small piece was valuable, and it had been chosen essentially at random from hundreds of items, we're going to need better lighting, I said, and realized I was already planning our attack on this treasure trove. Is that a yes? I thought about Charlotte. Probably back in Edinburgh or even safely back in the States by now, assuming I was stranded, helpless, and broken. I thought about my depleted bank accounts and my uncertain, financially ruined future. Then I looked around this warehouse full of possibilities and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Pure, unadulterated professional excitement. It's a yes, I said, but my voice was firm and clear. But I want a 60-40 split in my favor, and I want our agreement in writing first. Izzy roared with laughter and stuck out her hand. 60-40 and a proper contract it is. I knew I liked you, Pat Delaney. As we shook hands, surrounded by decades of forgotten treasures, I couldn't help but smile. Charlotte thought she'd left me with nothing. She'd actually left me with the first real opportunity I'd had in years to build something that belonged entirely to me. 3 weeks later, I was perpetually covered in a fine layer of dust. My fingernails were permanently stained with grime from years of neglect, and I'd never been happier. The physical labor of moving and cleaning felt therapeutic, a stark contrast to the emotional toxicity I'd endured. Isabel and I had established a routine that worked like a well-oiled, if slightly antique, machine. Mornings were spent in the silent, vast warehouse, meticulously cataloging items, gently unwrapping relics, and carefully dusting away decades of forgetfulness. Afternoons were dedicated to researching the history and potential value of the finds, using the surprisingly good, if occasionally temperamental, internet connection at the Shepherd's Rest. Evenings were for planning our next moves, discussing logistics, and sharing a meal. A true partnership blooming unexpectedly in the middle of the Highlands. The Royal Doulton-style figurine had been just the beginning. My training as a specialist in 19th century European textiles and artifacts proved invaluable, not just for textiles, but for understanding provenance and distinguishing true craftsmanship across different mediums. We'd found a complete set of not convenient to name designer crystal, its intricate cuts shimmering even under the warehouse's inadequate lighting, which Izzy's initial research suggested was worth more than my used car back home in the States. We uncovered a collection of Victorian-era jewelry, brooches and lockets nestled in a velvet-lined wooden box that made my heart race when I looked up comparable pieces online. The monetary value was piling up, transforming my grim financial situation into something manageable, perhaps even comfortable. And yesterday, wrapped securely in several layers of what looked like old, yellowed bed linens at the very back of the warehouse, beneath a stack of forgotten steamer trunks, we'd discovered something that made both of us stop and stare in silent awe. It was a painting. "That's not just any landscape," I told Izzy, carefully examining the canvas under the beam of my newly purchased high-powered LED flashlight. We'd cleaned a small section, and the depth of color was stunning. Look at the brushwork. Look at the signature, barely visible in the corner. The painting was small, maybe 18 inches by 12 inches, but it was exquisite. A highland scene with a kind of detail and color saturation that spoke of true, undeniable artistic skill. The depiction of the purple heather and the looming misty hills had a distinct feel, one I vaguely recognized from my deep immersion in European art history during my museum career. And in the bottom right corner, partially obscured by years of grime, was a signature that made my museum curator's heart pound hard against my ribs. I used the magnifying glass we'd bought in the village to scrutinize the faint script. It was a name I recognized, a major figure, the equivalent of the father of Scottish landscape painting in the 19th century. If this was authentic, we weren't looking at hundreds of pounds or even thousands. We were looking at a sum that could secure both my future and Izzy's retirement. "How do we know for sure?" Izzy had asked, her voice barely above a whisper, recognizing the weight of the moment. "We get it properly appraised," I'd said, already making plans in my head, the chaos of my personal life temporarily forgotten in the thrill of the professional hunt. "But first, we need to have it professionally cleaned and examined by an expert, someone who specializes in Scottish masters." That's how we'd ended up making our first trip to Edinburgh since I'd started my new life as an accidental antique dealer. Izzy drove us in her ancient, reliable, not convenient to name car brand, Land Rover, which handled the winding Highland roads with stoic grace. The carefully wrapped painting was secured in the back seat like precious cargo, nestled between wool blankets. We had contacted Izzy's neighbor's nephew, a man named Ewan McGregor, who ran a high-end auction house in the city, just as Izzy had mentioned. He had immediately referred us to a private art authentication service. The service operated out of a converted warehouse in Edinburgh's Old Town. The expert who examined our painting was a woman about my age named Dr. Catherine Murray, with sharp eyes and gentle hands that spoke of decades of experience handling priceless artworks. "Where did you acquire this?" she asked, her voice low and respectful as she carefully unwrapped the painting and set it on her examination table under bright, specialized lights. "It's been in storage for decades," Izzy explained, her excitement barely contained. "Part of an estate collection in a remote warehouse." Dr. Murray nodded and began her detailed examination, using tools and techniques I recognized instantly from my museum days: UV lights, micromagnifiers, and specific chemical swabs. It was a language I hadn't spoken fluently in years, but which came flooding back to me. After what felt like hours, she finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "Well?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "It's authentic," she said simply. "Mid-period work from the not convenient to name artist school, probably painted around 1820. The subject matter is consistent with his known work from that time, and the pigment analysis is right. The provenance, or history of ownership, is the main question here." Izzy and I exchanged a high-stakes glance. "And the value?" Izzy asked. "At auction, assuming proper documentation and provenance research," Dr. Murray stated, looking us straight in the eye, "I'd estimate between $15,000 and $20,000. I actually gasped, my breath catching in my throat. $20,000 for one small painting that had been gathering dust in a quiet Scottish warehouse. My mind immediately jumped back to Charlotte, the forged documents, and the paltry sum left in my savings. This one item represented more than 20 times what my daughter had left me. "However," Dr. Murray continued, her expression shifting slightly from professional assessment to cautious concern, "there's something else you should know." She turned her computer screen toward us, pulling up a database entry. "I ran the painting through our national record system, and there's a notation here from 1987. This piece was reported as part of a collection that went missing from the Campbell estate when the family lost their property to creditors." My stomach dropped, the exhilarating rush of the 20,000 valuation instantly replaced by cold dread. "Missing as in stolen?" "Not necessarily stolen," Dr. Murray said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of a scholar. "More likely sold privately to settle overwhelming debts, but without proper documentation of the sale being filed with the relevant authorities. It's not uncommon with estate collections from that era. Families in financial trouble often sold pieces quietly to avoid public scrutiny, especially when dealing with prominent pieces like this mid-period, not convenient to name artist. However, the official record remains marked as lacking clear transfer of ownership." "So, we can't sell it?" Izzy asked, the disappointment clear in her voice, which suddenly sounded heavy with the weight of our dashed hopes. "You can, but you'd need to do more research first," Dr. Murray explained. "You must find documentation of how the piece came to be in your warehouse. You need to establish a clear chain of ownership, what we call provenance. It's doable, but it takes time, meticulous historical work, and potentially some legal assistance to clear the title." She looked at me, likely sensing my background from my earlier knowledgeable questions. "Given your expertise, you could lead the research, but it will be a deep dive into Scottish archives and auction records." As we drove back toward Kilbride in Izzy's ancient Land Rover, the painting secured once again in the back seat, carefully wrapped and insulated against the bumps. I found myself thinking not about the potential complications, but fiercely about the possibilities. If we had one authentic, high-value piece like this, a piece of history with a mystery attached, what else might be hidden in that dusty warehouse? And more importantly, I was discovering that I had skills I'd forgotten I possessed. My professional self, the 19th century European textiles and artifacts specialist who thrived on solving historical puzzles, was finally waking up after years of domestic dormancy. "You look like you're scheming, Pat," Izzy observed with a dry chuckle from the driver's seat, pulling her eyes momentarily from the winding road. "I'm thinking," I corrected, a smile spreading across my face, fueled by adrenaline and the thrill of the chase. "I'm thinking about how to research the provenance of that painting, about what other treasures might be waiting for us, and about how your warehouse is about to become the most organized antique collection in all of Scotland." "Sounds like scheming to me," she said with a warm grin. That evening, as I sat in my little room above the pub, the rain drumming softly against the small window, I began my work. My laptop was open, displaying digitized estate sales and auction records from the 1980s. The task was monumental, requiring hours of sifting through minute, frustratingly vague details. But I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt energized. For the first time since my husband died 2 years ago, I felt useful, more than useful. I felt absolutely necessary. I was applying decades of specialized knowledge not to an anonymous museum collection, but to my own unexpected future, a future that Charlotte had intended to destroy. I caught myself smiling, genuinely, happily smiling, at a digitized page detailing a minor sterling auction lot from 1989. My life was chaotic. My bank account was nearly empty, and my relationship with my only child was irrevocably broken. Yet here I was, happier than I'd been in years. Charlotte's betrayal, painful as it had done the one thing she could never have intended. It had set me free to be myself again. My phone buzzed, vibrating on the wooden desk, and for a brief, awful moment my heart jumped. Maybe Charlotte had finally hit rock bottom. Maybe she was ready to apologize, to make things right, perhaps begging me to come home. But the message wasn't from Charlotte. It was from my sister, Susan, back in Michigan. "Haven't heard from you since your Scotland trip. How are you doing? Call me. We miss you." I looked at that message for a long time. The familiar, loving worry from Susan was a stark reminder of the safety net I had deliberately cut myself off from. It would be so easy to call her, tell her the full, horrific truth, accept her comfort, and beg her for money for a flight home. But that would mean going home broken and defeated, exactly as Charlotte expected. I looked around the small, warm room. The thick wool blanket, the strong coffee mug, the laptop open to historical records. I thought about Izzy's determination and the vast, silent potential of the warehouse downstairs. Taking a deep breath, I typed back a concise, deliberately ambiguous reply. "I'm doing better than I have in years. I'll call you soon with news." I knew I couldn't tell Susan the whole story yet, not until I had something concrete to show, something to prove that I wasn't just a stranded, swindled grandmother. I was beginning to suspect that Charlotte's cruel act might have been the best, most shocking gift I had ever received. I was about to find out just how right I was. The thrill of the impending discovery and the intellectual challenge of the provenance research washed away the last lingering fear. The breakthrough came exactly 6 weeks after I'd been abandoned in Kilbride. 6 weeks of poring over microfiche scans, digitized auction manifests, and dusty land registry records from the 1980s. My life had been reduced to a simple, gratifying rhythm. Research. Eat Izzy's excellent, fortifying food, sleep, and repeat. I was deep in research about Scottish estate sales when Izzy knocked on my door with an expression that immediately told me she had unexpected news, and judging by the slight tension in her jaw, the news was significant. "There's someone downstairs who wants to meet you," she said, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "Says he knew your family." "My family?" I echoed, surprised. I hadn't mentioned having any family connections to Scotland, mostly because I hadn't thought I had any. My grandparents had immigrated to the States from somewhere vague in Europe, and with both parents long dead, I'd never pursued any serious genealogy research. The thought of running into a distant American tourist who knew Charlotte or Mark sent a cold spike of panic through me. Did he say his name? "Duncan McLean," Izzy whispered, checking the hallway. "A local name, but the accent is polished. Definitely someone who's spent time outside the Highlands. Says he's connected to the Campbell estate." My blood ran cold. Campbell estate, the same name Dr. Murray had mentioned in connection with the missing, not convenient to name artist, painting. This couldn't possibly be a coincidence. The man waiting in the pub's small, quiet sitting room was probably in his early 70s, with snow-white hair and the kind of weathered, kind face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He stood when I entered, extending a hand with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, devoid of the aggressive curiosity I had become used to seeing from strangers. "Mrs. Delaney," he said gently, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a well-educated Scot. "I'm Alistair MacLean. I believe we may be related." I sat down, the shock making my legs feel suddenly unreliable. "Please sit," I said, trying to keep the suspicion out of my voice. "How did you know to find me here?" "Word travels fast in the Highlands," Alistair chuckled, settling into the armchair. "Especially when an American woman starts poking around in old estate records and asking very specific questions about missing artwork from the Campbell family collection." He paused, his blue eyes holding mine. "My solicitor in Edinburgh mentioned that someone was researching the 1987 auction of my father's holdings, specifically the Nasmyth-style landscape." My blood ran cold again. "I see from your expression that you know exactly what I'm talking about," Alistair continued gently. "The not convenient to name artist landscape specifically. Well, I have some news that might surprise ye. That painting was never stolen, and it was never truly lost." He pulled a thick, yellowed manila folder from his jacket and set it on the small table between us. "It was given as a gift to your great-grandmother, Margaret MacLean Delaney." The world tilted sideways. "My great-grandmother." "Margaret MacLean," he said, opening the folder to reveal brittle old documents and faded photographs. "My great-aunt. She married an American businessman named William Caldwell before your grandfather, who was visiting Scotland on business in 1921. When they left for America, my great-grandfather gave her several family pieces as a dowry, including the not convenient to name artist painting. I stared at the documents he was showing me. Immigration records, marriage certificates, and most importantly, a detailed, handwritten inventory of items given to Margaret MacLean upon her marriage, signed and witnessed in 1921. My mind, trained for historical analysis, instantly recognized the authenticity of the records. "But how did it end up in Izzy's warehouse here in Kilbride?" I asked, my head spinning with the sudden, impossible rush of family history. Alistair smiled sadly. "Margaret came back to Scotland in 1949 after her first husband died. She was in poor health and didn't have any children yet. She stayed with our family for several months, but she was too ill to travel back to America with all her possessions. So she left them in our care, with my grandfather, with instructions to hold them until she could return for them. And she never came back? She did, actually, in 1952, with her new husband and a baby daughter. Your grandmother. But by then she was happy and settled in her new life in the States, running a small textile importing business. She told my grandfather, her cousin, to keep the items or do with them as he saw fit. He, being a typical McLean, stored them in various places around the property, eventually consolidating them here, thinking he'd sort them out someday. He never did. I was having trouble processing this information. The sheer scope of this unexpected history was overwhelming. So the painting and all those boxes, they belonged to my family all along? More than that, Alistair said, pulling out another document, a legal affidavit dated much more recently. According to Scottish inheritance law, and given that you are Margaret's direct descendant and, based on my research, the only surviving member of that particular family line, everything she left behind legally belongs to you. Everything. The not convenient to name artist painting was just the beginning. There were jewelry pieces, the fine china sets, several other artworks, and boxes of family documents that my great-grandmother thought might be of interest to her descendants someday. My hands were shaking as I reached for the inventory list. The items Alistair was describing weren't just valuable. They represented a family history I'd never known existed, a powerful link back to the land where I was so cruelly abandoned. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, looking up at him, my professional suspicion resurfacing. "You could have kept quiet and let me continue thinking the painting was a legal complication." Alistair's expression grew serious. "Because I'm dying, Mrs. Delaney. Cancer. And I've been researching our family genealogy for the last 2 years, trying to tie up all the loose ends before I go. When I discovered you existed, and that you were here in Scotland, asking about these very records, it seemed like nothing short of providence. We spent the next 3 hours going through the documents, photographs, and family stories in Alistair's manila folder. My mind, which had been paralyzed by the shock of Charlotte's betrayal, now worked with a focused, almost ruthless efficiency, processing the historical data. The old photographs showed my great-grandmother, Margaret McLean, as a young woman with a determined gaze strikingly similar to my own, standing proudly next to her first American husband, the businessman, William Caldwell. There were letters, written in elegant looping script, detailing her journey to the States, and subsequent letters expressing her deep regret at being too frail to return to Scotland to retrieve her belongings. Alistair was a meticulous historian himself. He had cross-referenced the handwritten inventory from 1921 with later documents detailing the consolidation of his family's assets, confirming that the pieces left by Margaret had indeed been moved to the old wool warehouse by his grandfather sometime in the mid-1950s. Crucially, he had commissioned his own legal research to confirm the line of descent. "I needed to be absolutely certain," Alistair explained, sliding a formal, bound document across the table. "This is a declaration of title prepared by my solicitor, confirming your direct lineage to Margaret McLean Delaney, and by extension, your claim." I stared at the official legal seals and signatures. It was an overwhelming realization. I wasn't just a stranded woman digging through junk to survive. I was the legitimate heir to a forgotten family legacy. The total value of the items, the not convenient to name artist painting, the Victorian jewelry, the rare books, the fine china, the valuable Celtic artifacts Izzy and I hadn't even reached yet, was staggering. But why didn't the family keep the items? I asked, still grappling with the sheer generosity of the past. Because they were McLean's, Alistair said, smiling warmly. They held on to things out of sentimentality, not greed. They knew the items weren't their direct inheritance, and they always hoped a descendant of Margaret would eventually turn up. My father nearly sold them off during the 1987 financial troubles, but he was stopped by my mother, who insisted they remain untouched, just in case Margaret's line ever came back for them. When I started my genealogy research, and then my solicitor mentioned a woman with the name Delaney asking about the old Campbell estate records, I knew I had to act quickly. By the time Alistair left, I had a heavy folder full of legal documents, a clear, documented family history dating back to the 18th century in the Highlands, and a powerful, almost spiritual connection to the very patch of ground where my daughter had cruelly abandoned me. I called Izzy back into the sitting room and, holding the declaration of title, I explained everything. Izzy, who usually took everything in stride, was stunned into silence. She slowly picked up one of the old faded photographs of my great-grandmother. So, the woman who owned the pub next door to the warehouse has been guarding your family's inheritance for the last 5 years. Essentially, yes, I confirmed, laughing weakly. We were working on my treasure all along without knowing it. The significance of the inheritance was immense, but the personal meaning was even greater. Charlotte had systematically stripped me of everything, my savings, my security, and my dignity, in the belief that I was disposable. Yet here, in the place where I was supposed to be destroyed, the universe had given me a new, profound foundation. This changes everything, Izzy, I said, my voice full of awe. The 60-40 split we agreed on. Izzy waved her hand dismissively. That was for sorting through junk, Pat. This is entirely different. This is your family's history. I'm just happy to have been the keeper. No, I insisted. You were the lifeline. You provided the means, the workspace, and the encouragement when I had nothing. We're a partnership, and that doesn't change. We will use the proceeds from the pieces we sell, the ones that aren't central to the family archive, to formally establish a legal entity. We'll call it the McLean Heritage Collective, or something similar. I need you as my partner, managing the physical location and local logistics. That 60-40 split remains, but now it's based on a formal business agreement, legally drawn up between us. You deserve every penny for your principle and your kindness. Izzy looked at me for a long moment, a slow, deep smile spreading across her face. You know, Patricia Delaney, I think you're going to do just fine. That evening, I finally called my sister, Susan, in Michigan. I didn't hold anything back, recounting the betrayal by Charlotte and Mark, the theft of the $60,000, and the miraculous, unbelievable discovery of my Scottish inheritance. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a torrent of angry, protective emotion. I'm calling the police right now, Susan declared. We need to press charges against Charlotte. This is monstrous. No, Susan, I said firmly, my tone authoritative, the voice of the old museum coordinator returning fully. Not yet. I want this handled strategically. Charlotte and Mark think they've ruined me. They think I'm coming home broken and begging. I want to spend the next few weeks consolidating this inheritance legally through Alistair's contacts. I want to establish our business, and then I want to deliver a message to Charlotte that is loud, clear, and utterly devastating. She will learn that you don't steal a lifetime of security from the woman who raised you and get away with it. My sister took a shaky breath. Oh, Pat, what are you planning? I looked out the window at the misty Highland night, the tiny pub sign creaking in the wind. I'm planning a new life, Susan. And Charlotte and Mark are about to receive the final bill for my education. The next 2 weeks were the most productive and intellectually stimulating of my life. I wasn't just working, I was building. With Alistair McLean's solicitor, a sharp woman named Fiona, handling the formal declaration of title, I focused on the business structure. Isabel and I officially formed the McLean Heritage Collective, a limited partnership dedicated to the research, restoration, and sale of antique Scottish artifacts. Our first significant investment was in better security for the warehouse and professional lighting, transforming the dusty chamber into a fledgling, highly organized showroom. The value of the collection, even based on a preliminary inventory, was confirmed to be substantial, far exceeding the $60,000 Charlotte had stolen. My partnership with Izzy was seamless. Her local connections and pragmatic, no-nonsense approach perfectly balanced my historical knowledge and meticulous organizational skills. We had found a purpose together, forged in the heat of a crisis and cemented by mutual respect. During this time, I received several increasingly frantic text messages from Charlotte and Mark. They were panicked because my bank had officially closed the drained accounts and flagged the fraudulent transfers. They couldn't access the remaining few $100s, and more importantly, they realized the trail of their theft had gone cold. They assumed I was home, crying, and dealing with the police. They tried calling my sister, Susan, who, bless her loyalty, simply repeated my concise instructions. Pat's fine. She's busy. She'll call you when she's ready. This silence was deliberate. I needed them unsettled, paranoid, and financially pinched. I needed to control the narrative. The time for passive defense was over. Now it was time for the offensive. I decided the confrontation wouldn't happen on American soil, where I was just a plaintiff. It would happen right here, in Kilbride, where I was the victim, the newly established businesswoman, and the rightful heir to the very land they had abandoned me on. The lure had to be irresistible, a financial threat disguised as an easy solution. Working with Fiona, the solicitor, we crafted the perfect bait. Fiona sent a formal, brief, and deliberately vague letter to Charlotte and Mark's last known email address. The letter stated that Patricia Delaney had secured new legal counsel and was in the final stages of filing a comprehensive report with both American and Scottish authorities regarding the unauthorized depletion of financial assets. The final paragraph, however, contained the hook. Mrs. Delaney is, nevertheless, open to discussing a private, one-time resolution meeting in Scotland to settle the matter of the initial transfers, provided all parties are physically present to sign a non-disclosure and non-litigation agreement. I knew how Charlotte and Mark would interpret this. They would see one-time resolution and non-litigation agreement as weakness. They would assume I was simply too exhausted or too embarrassed by the situation to pursue criminal charges, and that I was willing to accept a small fraction of the stolen money to make the whole thing go away. They would calculate that a quick trip to Edinburgh to bully their old mother into signing something was cheaper than the legal fees or prison time. They would also believe they could intimidate me into handing over the remaining funds. The next day, Charlotte called me. I let it go to voicemail, but checked the transcription. "Mom, what is this nonsense? Filing reports. Look, you need to talk to me. Mark and I are willing to give you back, let's say, $10,000 as a gesture of goodwill, but you have to sign that paper. This needs to be resolved privately. We'll fly over. Where are you?" She hadn't asked if I was okay, or if I had a place to stay. She had gone straight to damage control and negotiation. She was taking the bait. I finally called her back, my voice calm, cool, and perfectly detached. Hello, Charlotte. I received your message. Yes, I am pursuing a resolution regarding the funds you transferred. If you wish to avoid the criminal charges Fiona mentioned, you and Mark need to be in Edinburgh next Tuesday. My solicitor has arranged a venue in a remote location near where you left me. It will be much quicker for me to travel there. Remote? Why remote? Mark's voice cut in, paranoid. Because I am very busy running my new business and this meeting is an inconvenience, I replied simply. I will send the exact location and time. Do not be late. And Mark, bring the documents from your Glasgow conference. You'll need them for the non-disclosure agreement. The mention of his conference was a subtle lie. He hadn't had one, but it was designed to make him believe I was still operating on old, outdated information, thereby confirming their belief that they held the upper hand. They agreed immediately, their voices tight with the conviction that they were about to fleece their naive, desperate mother one last time. As I hung up, Izzy, who had been listening intently, raised an eyebrow. A remote location near where they left ye? That sounds like the Kilbride Village Square. It is, I confirmed, pouring myself a celebratory cup of tea. And I'm not going to be alone. I have secured the assistance of Alistair MacLean and Fiona, the solicitor. They are my witnesses, my protection, and my executioners. We will meet them on the very patch of grass where they declared me a burden. It's time for Charlotte to pay her final bill. The day of the confrontation arrived, appropriately draped in the classic, dramatic mist of the Scottish Highlands. The entire atmosphere felt cinematic, a perfect stage for the final act of betrayal and revenge. I stood exactly where Charlotte and Mark had left me 6 weeks ago, on the patch of rough grass adjacent to the cobbled square of Kilbride. I was no longer the disheveled, panic-stricken grandmother with a dead phone. I was Patricia Delaney, co-owner of the MacLean Heritage Collective, and I was dressed for war. My tailored suit, which Charlotte had mocked as librarian attire, was crisp. My posture was impeccable, and the cold serenity in my eyes was something new. I was not alone. Standing discreetly near the entrance of the Shepherd's Rest was Izzy, acting as my silent witness and anchor. Across the square, positioned near the old post office, were Fiona, the solicitor, sharp and businesslike in a tailored coat, and Alistair MacLean, whose quiet, dignified presence lent immense moral and historical authority to the scene. At precisely 11 a.m., a sleek black rental car, far too expensive for a mere conference attendee, skidded slightly on the wet cobblestones and pulled up where their previous car had been. Charlotte stepped out first, looking stylish but visibly stressed, her expensive designer coat clashing aggressively with the rugged Highland backdrop. Mark followed, his face tight with a blend of false confidence and naked paranoia. They immediately scanned the empty square, looking for a corporate office building or a barrister's suite, the kind of place they imagined a settlement meeting should take place. They saw me, and they saw the backdrop of sheep, stone, and the familiar ancient pub sign of the Shepherd's Rest Inn. "Mom, what is this?" Charlotte demanded, walking toward me, her voice laced with familiar contempt. "Why are we meeting in a parking lot in the middle of nowhere? Where is the solicitor's office?" "This," I said, my voice calm and controlled, forcing them to stop several feet away, "is the place where you chose to leave me. It seemed an appropriate venue for our final discussion." "Don't be dramatic, Patricia," Mark sneered, stepping forward. "Let's just sign whatever settlement you've cooked up. We're willing to give you back $12,000 to avoid the mess. Where's the agreement?" "The agreement is right here," I replied, nodding toward Fiona, who instantly stepped forward. holding a manila folder that looked identical to the one Alistair had carried weeks ago. "But before you sign anything, we must address the nature of your crimes." "Crimes? Mom, don't be ridiculous. It was a loan, a mistake." Charlotte stammered, her composure cracking under the weight of Fiona's severe expression. "No, Charlotte," I interrupted, cutting her off with the finality of a judge. "It was theft. It was forgery. And it was financial elder abuse." Fiona took over, her voice crisp against the silence of the square. "Mr. Peterson, Ms. Peterson, I am Fiona McLeod, legal counsel for Patricia Delaney. My client is not here for a settlement. She is here to inform you that we have formally submitted a comprehensive report detailing the unauthorized transfers and the forged documents used to deplete her savings account of approximately $60,000 USD. Mark's face went instantly white. "Forged? That's slander. She authorized everything." "We have copies of the documents," Fiona said coolly. "My client also wants you to know that the local Scottish police have been informed of your abandonment of an elderly American citizen in a remote village, a factor that will certainly be added to the criminal complaint when we file in the American court system next week." Charlotte started weeping, a loud, theatrical noise I knew was purely manipulative. "Mom, you wouldn't do this. I'm your daughter. We just needed the money. I'll pay it back." I stepped forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You didn't just need the money, Charlotte. You systematically planned to destroy me. You left me here with nothing, believing I would crawl home defeated. You wanted my life to end in despair so you could live off my savings." Mark, recovering, tried a new tack. "Fine. You want the money? We'll drain the rest of the account and send it back. You'll have your money. Now you sign the release." "You cannot drain the rest of the account, Mark," I said, a slow, cold smile finally appearing on my face. "That account has been frozen by the bank at my instruction, and the money you transferred has already been legally absorbed." This statement hit them with physical force. "Absorbed into what?" Charlotte shrieked. "You don't have anything to absorb it into. You're stranded." That was my cue. I nodded toward Alistair, who stepped forward and presented the declaration of title. "Ms. Peterson," Alistair said, his voice quiet but commanding. "Your mother is no longer interested in the stolen $60,000. She is now the rightful, legally confirmed direct descendant and sole heir to the McLean heritage, a collection of family assets, artworks, and property that has been stored nearby for nearly a century." Fiona added the final devastating detail. "The current preliminary valuation of the assets owned by Mrs. Delaney and secured under her new legal partnership, the McLean Heritage Collective, is estimated to be approximately 20 times the sum you stole." The silence that followed was absolute. Charlotte and Mark stared at me, then at the elegant, silver-haired stranger, then at Izzy, then back at the simple wooden sign of the Shepherd's Rest. The remote location they thought was my place of despair was, in fact, the seat of my new empire. "You stole $60,000, I summarized, stepping past them toward Izzy. "And in doing so, you handed me an inheritance that will secure my future and my legacy, and which is now completely beyond your reach forever. You are a thief, Charlotte. I am an heiress. The debt is settled." I did not wait for their reply. I walked into the Shepherd's Rest, followed by Izzy, Fiona, and Alistair. As the heavy wooden door shut behind us, I heard Charlotte's anguished, desperate scream echoing across the quiet Highland Square. She was finally, truly defeated. Inside the Shepherd's Rest, the heavy wooden door muffled the sound of Charlotte's screams, reducing her hysterical rage to a distant, unpleasant buzzing. The local patrons who had witnessed my arrival 6 weeks earlier watched our procession, Izzy, Fiona, Alistair, and myself, with quiet, knowing satisfaction. We immediately retreated to the small, private sitting room, the same room where Izzy had first served me the life-altering cup of strong tea. "Well," Alistair said, breaking the silence with a dry cough, adjusting his coat. "That was certainly effective, Patricia." Fiona immediately opened her folder. "Now we move to the practical matter of the legal offense. The documentation we have is sufficient for criminal charges in the States, given the interstate wire fraud and forgery. We can also pursue civil action to reclaim the stolen $60,000, though their ability to pay is questionable now." I sat back, feeling an immense, powerful calm wash over me. The public shaming, the revelation of the vast inheritance, and the absolute destruction of their belief in their own power felt more satisfying than any long, drawn-out court battle. Justice had been served, not by law, but by destiny. "No criminal charges," I stated, the decision absolute. "I don't want them in prison. I want them broken." The goal was never maximum punishment, but final separation. Charlotte and Mark chose to sever our relationship entirely for $60,000. They need to understand the cost of that choice. I looked at Fiona. The injunction blocking the stolen funds remains active. They will spend months, likely years, trying to untangle their legal position in the States, and they have no money to hire decent counsel. Their careers are compromised by the impending criminal report we filed with the American authorities, even if we never follow through. Their reputations among their peers are now based on public exposure and imminent financial ruin. That is sufficient. Fiona nodded slowly, recognizing the cold, strategic calculation. "Understood. We'll proceed with legal defense only, ensuring they receive zero settlement and that the money they transferred remains locked down. They will have no access to the funds and no legal avenue to recover the inheritance." "Good," I confirmed. "Now let's talk about registering the McLean Heritage Collective as a nonprofit foundation to protect the ancestral pieces and transferring funds to Izzy's account for the initial 60-40 profit share from the smaller artifacts we've already sold." My priorities were settled: securing the past, rewarding loyalty, and building the future. The next few months flew by. The McLean Heritage Collective became a registered entity, its primary goal to research and catalog the extensive family collection. Alistair, despite his health struggles, became a devoted genealogical and historical advisor, thrilled to see his family history being preserved. Izzy managed the logistics and the growing influx of auctioneers and specialized dealers who, thanks to Ewan McGregor, were now descending upon Kilbride. I purchased a small, sturdy stone cottage on the outskirts of Kilbride, a cottage with a stunning view of the hills and the sea, which I secured entirely with funds generated from the sale of just 3 minor, non-ancestral pieces from the warehouse, including the not-convenient-to-name designer crystal set. For the first time since my husband died, I owned a home that was entirely mine, earned through my own effort and specialized knowledge. My relationship with Charlotte and Mark was completely over. They made several desperate attempts to contact me, sending rambling, blaming, and ultimately pathetic emails, which I filtered directly to Fiona. I learned through my sister, Susan, that they had lost their house in the States and were living with Mark's mother, their financial and professional ruin complete. I felt no regret, only the serene satisfaction of justice delivered. They had chosen to steal my life. I had responded by building a better one. 6 months after my abandonment, I found myself sitting on the porch of my new cottage. The air was crisp, the hills were green, and the only sound was the distant bleating of sheep, the same sound that had accompanied my despair. Now it sounded like the soundtrack to my freedom. I picked up my phone and called Susan one last time. "I'm sending you a package, Susan," I said, my voice calm and joyful. "It's a deed and the keys to my old house in Michigan. I've paid off the small mortgage remaining. Sell it, rent it out, do whatever you need to, but use the money for yourself. I won't be needing it." "Pat, what are you saying? You're not coming home?" Susan asked, her voice incredulous. "No, dear sister. I am home. I am sitting in my own cottage in the Highlands, running my own business. I found a family I never knew I had, and a purpose I thought I'd lost. Charlotte tried to destroy me, and instead, she gave me the best gift of my life, the courage to be free." I hung up, smiling. The life I'd planned, the comfortable retirement, the compliant mother, the doting grandmother, was gone. In its place was the life I had earned, the independent, determined curator, the successful businesswoman, the beloved member of a small Scottish community. I had been abandoned in the wilderness, and in that wilderness I had discovered my true self, and a treasure far more valuable than 20,000 years. Pat didn't just survive. She built a magnificent new life and legacy, proving you never steal from the woman who raised you. Thank you for watching this incredible story of ultimate revenge. If you want your voice heard, share your own story of family betrayal or triumph by sending it to womenstoriess@segmail.com.